own voice and dared to prophesy the fate of kings and nations. Isaiah was not just a prophet. He was a witness to visions that revealed humanity's future, from the darkest judgment to the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. Imagine being chosen by the Creator himself to carry a message of life or death, facing cruel kings, imminent wars, and the resistance of a rebellious people. Isaiah was that man, called amidst a vision of angels and divine glory. He challenged the empire of Assyria, confronted the idolatry of Judah, and announced the coming of a Messiah who would change the destiny of the world. Now, you will discover how Isaiah became the voice of God himself, and why his prophecies continue to impact us today. Isaiah was in the temple, as on many other days. But that day, something completely out of the ordinary happened. Amidst the walls that surrounded him, his vision opened to something much larger. He saw the Lord, sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the temple was filled with the divine presence. Around the throne, flaming angels, the seraphim, covered their faces with two of their wings. Their voices echoed with unbelievable power. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Their words made the place shake. The ground beneath Isaiah's feet seemed to tremble as if it were alive, and the air around him was filled with holy smoke. Faced with that overwhelming vision, Isaiah was overcome by a profound sense of smallness. He knew, deep in his heart, that he was faced with pure holiness, and this only made his own flaws and impurities stand out. He felt unworthy, lost, as if his entire life had been revealed in an instant. He muttered to himself, "Woe is me! I'm lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips." However, before he could sink into his despair, one of the seraphim flew towards him, carrying in his hands a burning coal taken from the altar. The angel touched his lips with the purifying fire. "Your guilt is removed and your sin is forgiven," said the heavenly voice. Isaiah was still panting, trying to understand everything that had just happened. His lips burned slightly, as if the touch of that hot coal was still there, reminding him of his purification. He had been forgiven. The guilt that once crushed him now seemed to dissipate, but something bigger was coming. When he heard that powerful voice asking, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" his heart skipped a beat. For a moment, Isaiah hesitated. Was it possible that God was speaking to him? The man who, moments before, felt unclean and unworthy? But at the same time, there was a flame burning inside him, as if the fire that purified his lips had also inflamed his soul. He knew he couldn't go back. Something had changed forever. Without knowing what awaited him, without having any idea of the challenges that lay ahead, Isaiah opened his mouth and, almost without thinking, the words came out. "Here I am, send me." It was a response full of dedication, courage, but also a restlessness that he still couldn't explain. He didn't know what the next step would be, but he felt that, somehow, he was ready. Soon, the divine voice continued, giving him a mission that would make him confront not only his people, but the nations. Isaiah was being sent with a harsh, judgmental message to a people who refused to listen. God warned him, they see it, but they don't see it. They hear, but they don't understand. Isaiah now knew there would be no going back. He had offered himself, and God would send him with a difficult message, a word that would bring unrest and fear into the hearts of the people. But the Lord was clear. The message would not be easy to accept. Those words resonated in Isaiah's mind. He was being sent to speak to a people who had hardened their hearts, a people who chose to close their ears and eyes to the truth. As he reflected on the weight of his mission, Isaiah felt a tightness in his chest. He knew dark times were at the door. God had commissioned him to announce that Judah would be devastated, that the cities would be destroyed and the people taken into exile. As a messenger, Isaiah would have to stand before kings, leaders, and crowds, speaking of a dark future. But who would listen? Who would believe your words? The Lord had already warned him. Most would not listen. Visions of destruction were clear in his mind. He saw the city in ruins, the sound of crumbling walls, the dry land and devastated fields. It was as if he was walking through the streets of a ghost town, where only the memories of the past still existed. Each prophecy that God revealed to him seemed heavier than the last, and Isaiah knew that carrying this message would be like carrying an invisible cross. But there was something more. Even in the face of all that vision of judgment and pain, there was a hidden promise, a spark of hope that God whispered in the midst of the storm. Isaiah left his experience with God, carrying the weight of the mission entrusted to him. He knew he was being sent to speak to a people who didn't want to listen, and this became clear when he began to preach. People looked at him, but it was as if their eyes were closed to the truth. They heard his words, but it was as if their ears were covered, unable to understand what was being said. He walked the streets of Jerusalem, talking about the future destruction that God had shown. He warned of the devastation that would come if the people continued in their ways of idolatry and disobedience. But the more he spoke, the more it seemed like his words fell into emptiness. People went on with their lives, worried about the now, without caring about tomorrow. It was as if they were blind to the imminent danger, trapped in an illusion of safety. Isaiah felt like a lonely voice in the desert, crying out for attention in the midst of indifference. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the pain of seeing the people sinking into their own spiritual blindness was greater than he imagined. Every time I went up to a place to preach, I saw the same apathetic expressions. I knew God said this would happen, but it was still hard to accept. And yet, in the midst of all that darkness, Isaiah was certain. There was a little light, a promise, something that God would preserve. Even if the majority didn't listen, not everyone would be lost. Isaiah walked through the streets with the weight of his mission, feeling the silence of the people as a reflection of their hardened hearts. But in the midst of widespread rejection, something sustained him. God had told him about a remnant, a small group that, despite everything, would remain faithful. They would be like a seed hidden in a devastated land, ready to sprout when everything around was destroyed. Isaiah held this promise like a thread of hope. As warnings of doom hung in the air, Isaiah knew that not everyone would be lost. There would be those who, even in the midst of chaos, would maintain their faith unshakable. They would be living proof that God still cared for his people, even in the darkest of times. Isaiah spoke of this promise with an intensity that almost shone in his words. He saw the remnant as a small sprout that was reborn after the tree trunk was cut. As much as the people of Judah were compared to a dry and lifeless tree, from this apparently dead trunk, a new branch would emerge. But how would the people react to this foreshadowing? Most continued to ignore the warnings, wallowing in their own sins and refusing any change. For many, the idea of devastation seemed distant, almost unreal. Isaiah, however, saw the storm brewing on the horizon. Even with his clear vision of the judgment to come, he couldn't help but wonder, what would it take for the remnant to rise up in the midst of desolation? How would this small spark of faith survive what was to come? In the midst of so much uncertainty, one man emerged as a beacon of hope for Isaiah and the people of Judah. Hezekiah, the new king, looked different from those who came before him. He was a man who feared God and who, against all odds, sought to restore true faith in the heart of the nation. When Isaiah met him, he felt that perhaps this king could do what many before him had failed: bring the people back to the ways of the Lord. Hezekiah was determined. He destroyed pagan altars and broke the idol images that corrupted the faith of the people. His courage in facing idolatry impressed Isaiah. Finally, it seemed that someone in power heard the prophet's voice and recognized the urgency of his message. The kingdom, for a brief moment, breathed a sigh of relief, as if a new chance were within reach. Isaiah became Hezekiah's counselor, guiding him spiritually in times of uncertainty and danger. Hezekiah was not just a king who listened to the prophet. He deeply believed that God was the only one who could save Judah from disaster. It was an alliance that gave Isaiah a little more hope. After all, he had seen kings and leaders ignore his warnings, but Hezekiah was different. However, the approaching threat was not small. The powerful empire of Assyria, feared by all nations, was moving toward Jerusalem. Isaiah knew that Hezekiah's strength and faith would be brutally tested. The news spread quickly. The Assyrian army was marching toward Jerusalem. The city, once bustling with its routines, now lived under the shadow of fear. The empire of Assyria was known for its cruelty and overwhelming strength. City after city fell to his soldiers, and the imminent siege of Jerusalem seemed inevitable. Panic spread. People asked themselves, how would they survive this overwhelming threat? Hezekiah, even though he was a devout king, knew that he could not face the Assyrians with Judah's military strength. The city's army was small, weak, and the walls, although solid, did not seem enough to contain such a violent attack. He then sought the advice of Isaiah, the prophet who had always guided him in difficult times. Isaiah, in turn, did not seem shaken. He trusted in something much greater than armies and swords. As the enemy approached, Isaiah gave Hezekiah a message of courage straight from God. Do not be afraid of what you are about to hear. The prophet, with a firmness that defied the desperate situation, assured the king that God would fight for Jerusalem. No matter the size of the Assyrian force or its threats of destruction, Isaiah saw what no one else could see. The invisible hand of God was ready to act. Still, outside, the siege was closing, and the walls of Jerusalem began to feel pressure from the enemy. The arrogant Assyrian general laughed at Hezekiah's confidence, mocking his faith in God. War seemed inevitable, but Isaiah knew that the real battlefield was not on the city walls. The tension in Jerusalem was palpable. Hezekiah's soldiers watched the walls, seeing the Assyrian army gathering like a sea of destruction about to swallow the city. The Assyrian general, Rabshakeh, sent messengers who shouted insults in broad daylight, mocking Hezekiah and the God of Israel. No nation has been able to resist us, they cried. And you think your God will save you? The enemy's arrogance only increased despair in the hearts of the people. Hezekiah, however, did what few kings would have the courage to do. Instead of giving in to fear or giving in to the enemy, he entered the temple of the Lord, with tears in his eyes and a heavy heart. He knelt and gave his cause to God. He knew that, humanly, the battle was lost, but his trust was not in armies or political alliances. Isaiah, beside him, remained firm with a calm face. The voice of the Lord had already spoken to him. I will defend this city to save it. Then, one night when terror hung over Jerusalem like a thick cloud, something inexplicable happened. When morning arrived, what was seen was a scene of total astonishment. The Assyrian army, which had previously gathered like a plague around the city, had been decimated, without any battle or bloodshed. The angel of the Lord had passed into the enemy camp, and thousands of Assyrian soldiers were dead. Sennacherib's great army, which had previously seemed invincible, was now reduced to nothing. The silence was deafening. Sennacherib, humiliated and defeated, fled. The relief that gripped Jerusalem after the fall of the Assyrian army was immense. The miracle, the divine intervention, left no doubt. God was with Hezekiah and the people of Judah. But Isaiah knew that his mission did not end there. The prophet had something even greater to reveal, something that was not for that immediate moment, but for the distant future. He started talking about a new hope, something that surpassed the wars and threats that surrounded Judah at that time. It was a vision of peace and restoration, focused on a person who would transform the history of humanity forever. Isaiah began to prophesy about the Messiah, a king unlike any other. He spoke of a boy who would be born, a son who would bring with him true peace. For a child is born, a son the Lord has given us, and the government will be on his shoulders, Isaiah proclaimed, with a voice that carried the strength of centuries to come. And his name will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Those words filled hearts with hope, but they also left an uneasiness in the air. Who would this Prince of Peace be? When would he come? Isaiah did not offer dates, only certainties. What he saw in his prophetic vision was the emergence of a king who would govern with justice and compassion, bringing redemption not only to Judah, but to all nations. An eternal kingdom would be established, and the suffering of the people would finally come to an end. Isaiah knew that before this promise was fulfilled, difficult times still awaited. The people of Judah still digest the great promise of the Messiah when Isaiah began to speak of something equally impressive: the fall of Babylon. At that time, Babylon was not yet the great power it would become, but Isaiah already saw the dark future of that city in his visions. He described Babylon as an oppressive force that would rise with pride and arrogance, conquering nations and spreading its power throughout the world. However, its fall was inevitable, and Isaiah saw it as a symbol of God's judgment on all the empires that rose against him. The Babylon that Isaiah described, it was more than a city. She represented the spirit of rebellion against God, a nation that believed itself to be indestructible. "You will descend to the dust," he said, foreshadowing the destruction to come. What seemed invincible to human eyes, to God was just another kingdom that would fall before his justice. This vision frightened and intrigued those who listened to Isaiah. If even a city as powerful as Babylon was to fall, what did that mean for the rest of the world? What would happen to other nations that followed the same path of pride and idolatry? For Isaiah, Babylon was not just a distant nation. He saw in it the harbinger of something much greater: world judgment. He prophesied that the kingdoms of the earth, no matter how great, could not escape God's watchful eye. And just as Babylon would fall, other empires would also come and go until the kingdom of the Messiah was established. But before that happened, another more mysterious vision was waiting. Isaiah began to talk about a servant, someone who would carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Isaiah continued to speak, and the tone of his prophecies changed. The images he described now were different from the visions of destruction and fall of great empires. Instead, he began to talk about someone very special, a servant chosen by God. But this servant would not be a glorious king with armies or crowns. On the contrary, Isaiah described a man of sorrows, someone who would bear the sins of the people, who would suffer and be rejected. He was despised and the most rejected among men. Isaiah said in a voice full of emotion, "A man marked by pain, familiar with affliction." The words were heavy, and the people listened with a mixture of surprise and uneasiness. Who would this servant be? Why would he have to suffer so much? Isaiah saw clearly. This servant would not only suffer, but he would be wounded because of the sins of many. He was bruised because of our mistakes and crushed because of our sins. The punishment that brought us peace fell on him, and his wounds healed us. These words created an image of sacrifice and redemption that was difficult to understand at the time. A king who would suffer, a servant who would carry the burden of everyone's sin. It was as if Isaiah was painting a portrait of someone who would be, at the same time, victorious and humiliated. A deep mystery surrounded this figure, someone who would suffer to bring healing, who would be rejected so that others could be accepted. The people did not fully understand, but Isaiah knew that this servant was destined to change the destiny of many. And even more, a promise of renewal and restoration was to come. While Isaiah's words about the suffering servant still hung in the air, the prophet began to reveal something even grander. He spoke of a time when surpassed the limits of imagination, a time when suffering, injustice, and pain would disappear completely. He saw a new heaven and a new earth, where the old things were no longer would exist more. Isaiah described in detail a total renewal, something that would transform everything men knew. Peace would reign, and justice would be like a river that never dries. "Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth," said Isaiah, his voice full of hope. "And the former things shall be remembered no more, neither will remember them." It was a promise that the world's suffering would be forgotten, like a shadow that disappears with the dawn light. Isaiah's words painted such vibrant images that it was almost possible to see before your eyes a future where there would be no more crying, where tears, sicarium, and lamentation would be replaced by joy. Isaiah's vision was of a place where people would live in harmony, where the nations would no longer would raise against nations, and true peace would reign. He spoke of wolves and lambs grazing together, children playing without fear, and an abundant life for all. It was a return to what creation should have been from the beginning, before sin entered the world. However, before this total renewal took place, Isaiah knew that many challenges